Hello fellow Unreal Engine designers and developers. In today's episode we're going to be adding pillars to our spline wall system. So whether it's an obvious pillar here to blend in our corners and hide unsightly artifacts, or even less obvious pillars just to cover up the cracks without it being obvious there's a pillar there. I'll be showing you how to achieve both. So let's get straight into it. Welcome back to the series. If you haven't seen any of my videos before, then make sure you have done the previous two videos on creating the spline wall system, so you get to the same point we are now. So we're going to add pillars to our wall system today, but before we do that, there's a couple of issues I want to resolve. The first one you can see pretty obviously here, which is when we have any angles in the spline, the ends are not displayed properly. You can see they're transparent here at this 90-degree angle, and if I go over here you can see that they're not displayed properly. The normals are somewhat messed up. So first thing I want to do is just sort that problem out. Now we are going to be covering these angles by pillars, but I just want to show you how you can fix it, or 99% fix it anyway. And then we'll look at two ways of covering it up with pillars. So let's jump into our blueprint, and I want you to find the section where it calculates the start and end mesh details. So this is calculating the distance to the start of the mesh and the distance to the end of the mesh. And I found from some experimentation that if I just extend that distance by 1 on each side, that gets rid of that distortion. Effectively, the end of this mesh and the start of this mesh, because it's a clamped tangent, the tangent is 0. So if we shift it along slightly, it will make the tangent something that it can actually calculate. So all we need to do is stretch that out. Now, it's always a good practice in blueprints, if you have any repeating nodes, to collapse them into either a function or a macro. So you can see here, these 4 nodes here are exactly the same as these 4. So the only difference between macros and functions is that macros you can do a bit more in, and macros cannot be called from external classes or external blueprints. So we don't need this to be called from an external blueprint. So select these 4 here, right click and do collapse to macro. And we'll call this macro calc distance to mesh. And you can see there's one when I practiced it before. That's one I've done here as well. And what we can do now is we can delete these 4 here, and it created a float here for some reason. I think it's because I connected it to the float already, but if you right click on that you can change that back to an integer, because you're just adding 1 to an index. And then we can drag off this, do calc distance to mesh, and we've got the same one here, and then you would connect it to the distances. So that's much cleaner. And if you want to see what's in the calc distance to mesh, just double click it and it will show you what's in there if you need to change anything. Okay, so now we've got exactly the same as we had before. What I want to do is I want to subtract 1 from the distance of the start and add 1 to the distance of the end, just to stretch it out by 1 centimeter. So I'm going to drag out here and do a minus and subtract 1, and then connect that to the 2 distances here. And then on this one I'll drag it out, do a plus and add 1 to the distance, and reconnect it to the distance of the get location and the get tangent. Okay, so all we've done really is reduce the distance slightly at the start and increase the distance slightly at the end when it's calculating. So do a compile. A quick shortcut for this, by the way, if you don't want to keep coming up here and hit compile, just do F7 on your keyboard and it will compile for you. Okay, let's go back, and you can see straight away it's looking a lot better. Now it's not perfect. If you get close up on this one, it's actually looking pretty good. But if I go to the one over here, let's have a look. That's not looking too bad. Let's come in here. But you will see on some angles, let's see if I take this here and I stretch this out slightly, can you see there's a slight crease in here, a slight gap in there. Now it's a lot better than it was before, but this is where the pillars will come in useful to cover up some of those literal cracks in the wall. So before we do that, let's move on and do the second update to the blueprint that I want to do just for convenience. So the second update I want to do to the blueprint is to allow the user to select a wall mesh when they drag the spline wall into the scene, rather than have it hard coded. So at the moment you can see that in this add spline mesh component we've decided that we're going to use this wall segment rather than any other mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear that. So if I go down here and clear this, so now we're adding a spline mesh component without any mesh at all, and I'll create a new variable over here. Let's add here. The type is going to be static mesh, and you want to have, there's quite a few here, you want to choose static mesh on its own object reference, and then give it a name, F2 here, and I'm going to call this wall mesh. And if you click on the I symbol here, it makes it user editable or instance editable. So compile that, and you could put in a default value if you want. I'll leave it empty so that it's a complete blank canvas. And now what we need to do is we need to set that static mesh. So we've added the component, so we create a little bit of extra space here at the end. So just move this one along a bit, and we will drag off the add spline mesh component, and if you do set static mesh and connect it in between, so connect it to that and then connect it on to the attached component, and now here we can plug in our variable. So from wall mesh, drag it up here and plug that in. So now this will be a variable that the user can decide on. So now we know the mesh, we can do a couple of extra things. First of all, we can decide whether to generate anything. So if there's no wall mesh selected, we'll just we won't do anything. And secondly, we can calculate the width automatically. So at the moment, the mesh length is something that the user had to put in. So I'm going to change that to a private variable, not instance editable. And I'm now going to calculate that at the start of this blueprint automatically. So all the user has to do is choose which wall segment they want to use. So let's go all the way back to the start of the blueprint. And the first thing I'm going to do, let's drag that back a little bit, give us a bit of extra space. First thing I'm going to do is to see if there is a wall mesh set. So use Control and drag this in. And if you right click and convert to a validated get, we'll place that here. So what we now have is two outputs: is valid if a wall mesh has been set, and is not valid if there is nothing. So if it's not valid, we'll stop there and won't do any more processing. But if we do have a wall mesh, let's calculate the width of that mesh. So what I'm going to do now is something that's again useful for neatness in your blueprints, which is a sequence node. So type sequence, and it just allows you to do sort of step-by-step instructions. So we'll connect the bottom one to the current loop, and then what we'll do is, before we go through calculate each spline segment, we'll do another bit of code to calculate the mesh length. So in order to do that, drag off the wall mesh here and do get bounding box, and let's just double click here, create a nice routing node. And what the bounding box is the size of that mesh on the X, Y, and Z axis. So if you split the output pin, you get a minimum of, it's a vector, so this is the X, Y, Z component of the minimum part of the box and the XYZ of the maximum part of the box. And then all we need to do is we need to subtract from the maximum, do a subtract of the minimum, and that will give us the absolute values on the X, Y, and Z. Okay, so we can now split this pin as well. So we've got X, Y, and Z output, and we're not interested in the length of the Y or the length of the Z. We're just interested in the length of the X value. And so if we drag out our mesh length using the Alt key, we'll get a set mesh length. So take our X component, which is the length we want, and that's what we're going to set that to. And then finally connect it to the sequence node here. Double click to neaten it up. And final thing we ought to do is create a nice little comment for here. So drag around here, C for comment, and we'll say calculate mesh length. And let's just drag that up slightly. And again, tidy these up. Okay, so now we've got that. So it will calculate the mesh length. It won't, if we've got a mesh, it'll go through, it'll calculate the mesh length, and then everything else will work as before. So let's compile this, or hit F7 to compile it. Come back here, and at the moment you see in our spline nothing. And that's because if we look at the right hand side in the details, we haven't set a wall mesh yet. So if we click here and do wall and choose our wall segment, you can see we're back to where we were before. And if you create other meshes, you can put them in there as well. So let's now finally move on to actually creating our pillars and implementing them in the blueprint. So I'm going to create two pillar meshes, one that is an obvious pillar and one that blends in with the corners just to hide the cracks. So as we've done in earlier episodes, we go into the modeling mode with up here, or either Shift 5. And what I'll do is I will create a cylindrical pillar. So for that, I'm going to use my cylinder object. And if you put it just in the scene near one of the walls, and we can start to adjust some of the parameters. So we want it to be a static mesh. The radius, you can choose what you want, but I'm going to go with 30, I think. Yep, 30. The height, I want to make it just slightly higher than the wall. So our wall's 400, so let's do 410. So it's just slightly higher. Radial slices, it will be how smooth it is as a cylinder. So 16, it sounds fine to me. Everything else looks pretty good. Let's assign the material now as well. So we'll assign the same brick material here. And then let's just have a look at this closer up. So it looks like the scale of the texture is not quite right. So let's try and change the scale here to 5. And that now looks more in keeping with the bricks on the wall. Okay, and finally, make sure you got your snapping on here. It just makes it easier to see it in place, as long as you've been snapping everything before. If I just drag this here to the start of the wall, you can see kind of what it will look like in place. And that looks pretty good. You might not want to make it so big, you might want to make it 20, but so it's a bit obvious to you, I'll stick with that. So I'm happy with that mesh, so let's click accept. Do Control B to browse, and let's give it a name of pillar. And now I'll delete that one, and let's create a smaller one that's more useful for just blending the angles together. So choose the same tool. You'll have the same settings here as before, so drag your cylinder in here, and this time we want to make the radius smaller. So if you remember, the wall was 20 centimeters deep. So if we make the radius 10 here, and I might even make the height the same, 400. Let's drag that in, have a look. So you can see that looks kind of just like it's a circular end to the wall. There's a slight bit of Z fighting at the top, so you might want to make it slightly more, but I'll leave mine as it is. And if I drag it over to this corner here, you can see that it does a really good job of just blending those walls together. And when it's in here, it'll hide that crack as well. So click accept, Control B, and we'll name this one Let's go over here, F2, to name it. I'll call it pillar underscore blend. Okay, so we've got two options now, either the obvious pillar or the pillar that blends the corners together. And now we will go back to here, we'll just select it, the pillar, and just delete it from the scene. And now we've got the meshes, we're ready to update our blueprint to add the correct logic to generate them at the clamp tangents. So we're back in the blueprint, and for our pillars we don't want to stretch them along the spline, we simply want to put the meshes at the spline points that have corners. So for that, instead of using spline mesh components, we're going to use instance static meshes. So we're going to create an instance static mesh for the pillar, and then we're going to add instances on the corners. So the first thing we need to do in the blueprint is just add that instance static mesh for the pillar mesh we're using. So let's add another mesh variable here. So if you just select the wall mesh, do Control D to duplicate, and we'll call this one pillar mesh so that the user can choose which pillar they want. And in our start of the blueprint here, we'll add another pin to the sequence. So above this 0, if you right click and do insert execution pin before, we'll drag up here and do add instance static mesh component. So next we want to keep a record of this instance static mesh component. So right click on the return value, promote to a variable, and we'll call this variable pillar ISM for pillar instance static mesh. And then final thing we need to do is we need to set the static mesh component that we want to use. So if you come off here and do static mesh, so we've got set static mesh here. So we can get rid of that because we've already got the pillar ISM plugged in, and now we need to plug the mesh. So this is our pillar mesh variable. Click on that, put that in there, and go around all of these, comment it, and say set pillar mesh. So we now have the instance static mesh here. Let's just double click here, create a little bit of clear routing. So we've now got the pillar mesh. It's not in the scene yet, but as we go through the spline points, we can add the pillar mesh from this static mesh component. So let's go down to where we're going through the spline segments. So this for loop here is going through each spline point, and it'd be useful to have another sequence node here. So where as it's going through each spline point, we'll do our calculation and spawning of the wall meshes, and then after we've done that for each point, we'll work out if it's a corner point and generate a pillar. So we need to create a little bit of extra space. Let's drag around here and just drag it back a little bit, and we'll create a sequence node. So drag out from here, sequence, and the first part of the sequence is to generate our wall meshes, and the second part of the sequence is going to be generate the pillar if necessary. And just to neaten this up a bit, this current spline index, let's just disconnect these. So use the Alt key to disconnect them, and then just drag your current spline index into here, and also connect it into here as well. It's just a bit neater now, and that way if we move that further afield, we've still got the current spline index obviously connected. Okay, so we need to create a new bit of code now. So this is going through each spline point. So the first thing we need to do is to work out if this is a corner point. So to do that, you can get the spline point type. So here, get spline point type. And it needs an index. So we've got a current spline index up here. So let's duplicate that. Control D, and we'll plug that into the index. So this is getting the type of spline point as it goes through each of these points. And if you bring out the return value and do an equals on your keyboard, and you want the equal enum, enumerator, and this will now give you the different options for the point types. So we've got linear, curve, constant, curve clamped, and curve custom tangent. So when we're hitting Shift T on our points, we're getting curve clamped to give us the corners. So those are the corners that we want to put pillars on, the curve clamped points. So we now have a true or false, depending on whether that point is clamped or not. So press B on the keyboard to get our branch node. And this is our first real execution pin. So let's connect that to here. Double click to reroute. And plug the output of the test into the branch condition. Okay, so now we know if it's false, if it's not a clamped corner, then we don't need to do anything. But if it's true, we want to add the instance static mesh here. So let's do that and do add instance. In fact, what we want to do is add an instance. So if we get our pillar instance static mesh variable here, control, drag it in, and if you drag off there and do add instance, we're now actually going to add one of the pillar meshes to the scene. So click on that, and it's asking where do we want to put it? Well, we want to put it at the spline point. So to get the spline point, we need to again get spline or get location at spline point. And don't forget, again, make sure that we plug the current index in there. So over here, current spline index, and drag that in here so that we're getting the current point. Move things around if necessary. And in fact, let's have a look at this. It's asking for an instance transform. So that's location, rotation, and scale. So I wonder if there's a get transform at spline point we can use. So let's do that. Get transform. Yeah, get transform at spline point. Then we don't have to do any calculations. So plug the index in, and now we now have the space or the transform here we can plug in here. And that should be everything we need to generate pillar meshes. So let's click around here and call it generate pillars at clamped corners. Okay, and neaten it up. Okay, F7 to compile. Let's go back to our spline here. So let's go, actually let's come out of modeling mode so we can see a bit more. Right, select our spline. And at the moment you can't see anything here, but we haven't selected a pillar mesh yet. So in this drop down here, let's do pillar and select our pillar. And lo and behold, at our two clamped corners, we now have the pillars. And if you don't want them to be so visible, we can select our pillar blend. And now you can see that we have a nice blended corners, and it fills in that crack there as well. So you can choose. Now you don't have to have circular ones. You can have square pillars or more ornate pillars. You choose which mesh you want. So let me go back to the original one. And you can see now that if I select a spline point, if I do T to make it curve, it goes back to a non-pillared corner. And if I do Shift T, it becomes a corner with a pillar. If I select this one and do Shift T, I've got a nice angle and a pillar here, T, and it goes back to a curved tangent. Now there's one last thing I've got to do in the blueprint. I'll show you the issue we've just got to address. If I select the start of the spline and do Shift T, I can get the pillar there. But if I select the end and do Shift T, I don't get a pillar. And that's because we were only processing the points from 0 to this one here, the penultimate point. So we just need to make sure we process this last point for pillars as well. So it's quite simple to do. We will come back to our spline wall blueprint, and you can see, if I zoom in a bit here, we're going through each of the spline points from 0 to the penultimate one here. So what we'll do is when we've completed this loop, so we've been setting this current spline index, so the current spline index will be set to the penultimate one by the time we get to the end of this loop. So when we've completed it, what we'll do is we will increment the current spline index. So you can do increment integer here, and we will plug in our current spline index. So what that does is it takes that variable, adds 1 to it, and then sets the variable to the new value. And then we will just plug this in to the logic here. So that's as simple as that. So what we'll do is the loop's completed, and we'll do one final thing of adding 1 to the current spline index and then going through generating the pillars if it's a clamp corner. And if I compile that with F7, if I go back, you'll see that that clamped corner at the end has now been has now had a pillar generated. So non-pillar and Shift T, it's got the pillar there. So that's everything for today's episode. I was planning to show doors, but I think this particular video is long enough, so I'll do that in the next episode and show you how to create a simple door system for your spline walls. So see you in the next one, and bye for now.